Welcome to the Fear Archives. Some places don't just remember the past, they hold on to it. Black Hollow Manor isn't just a haunted house, it's a predator. And tonight, the Spectre Seekers would learn that some shadows don't just watch, they wait. Before we begin, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And now, let's step into the darkness together. The old cafe at the edge of town was nearly empty, its booths scarred with carvings from bored teenagers and drifters. A rusty jukebox sat in the corner, silent. The faint scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Lucas sat at the head of the table, his elbows pressed against the scratched surface. In front of him was a worn notebook, filled with handwritten notes and rough sketches of the manor. His eyes were sharp, restless, the look of someone carrying the weight of too many failures. "All right," he began, his voice low but steady. "We've all seen the reports. Black Hollow Manor isn't like the other places we've investigated. No staged hauntings, no hoaxes, it's real." The room fell quiet. Marie adjusted her glasses and folded her hands. "Real doesn't mean we're ready. If the rumors are even half true, people don't just see things in that house. They disappear." James leaned back in his chair, adjusting his camera harness. "And yet, here we are." He forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Look," Ethan said, chewing his gum in slow, deliberate bites. "I get it. You all want answers, closure, proof. But what if we're walking into something we can't walk out of?" Nina, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of something raw beneath it. "I've felt it since I was a kid. Things no one else can see. I'm tired of running away." Lucas met her gaze and nodded. "Me too." The group fell into silence again. Then Marie cleared her throat. "If we do this, we do it right. No shortcuts. No splitting up for stupid reasons." James chuckled. "We're ghost hunters, not Scooby-Doo." "You know what I mean," Marie shot back. She looked at Lucas. "This isn't just another YouTube episode, Lucas. This is real life." Lucas's jaw tightened. He knew what she was saying, what they were all saying. But they didn't understand what this meant to him. This wasn't just a case. This was a chance to make up for Seattle. "We have a chance to do something that matters," he said finally. "To prove that we're not just chasing shadows. We're not just making content. We're making history." Nina nodded. "I'm in." James sighed and crossed his arms. "Well, somebody's got to film it." Ethan threw up his hands. "Fine. But if I get dragged into some hell dimension, I'm haunting you, Lucas." Marie hesitated, staring at the chipped table. Then she exhaled and pulled her research folder from her bag. "Then let's make sure we don't get dragged anywhere." Lucas closed his notebook with a sharp snap and stood. "All right, let's pack up." As they left the cafe, the doorbell jangled faintly behind them. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. Lucas looked up at the darkening sky and felt the weight of what was coming. Black Hollow Manor was waiting. The van's tires crunched over the gravel path, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. The headlights barely cut through the dense trees lining the road, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands reaching toward the vehicle. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. Lucas tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. His eyes locked on the silhouette of Black Hollow Manor as it loomed at the end of the path. The house wasn't just massive, it was monstrous. The roofline sagged like a broken crown, and the chimneys jutted upward like jagged tombstones. Ivy had clawed its way up the stone walls, suffocating the windows, which glinted faintly like hollow eyes watching them approach. He pulled the van to a stop, the engine's low hum fading into the silence. He exhaled slowly, the breath thick in his chest like smoke from an unseen fire. This isn't just another investigation, Lucas reminded himself. This is redemption. Ethan cracked his gum from the passenger seat and gave a half-hearted smirk. Well, we're here. His attempt at bravado rang hollow. This better be worth it. In the back, Nina wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the house as if it were breathing. The air outside wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, thick with something that pressed against the skin and weighed down her lungs. She glanced up at the second floor and froze. A face, pale and indistinct, was pressed to the upper window. It didn't blink. Her breath caught in her throat. Nina? Marie's soft voice cut through the fog of fear. She shifted in her seat and leaned closer, concern knitting her brow. Nina blinked hard and forced herself to smile, though her lips trembled. I'm fine, she lied. Marie didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. The iron gate groaned on its hinges as Lucas shoved it open. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the clearing, cutting through the silence like a scream. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up. He spat out his gum and stepped closer to Lucas. The house loomed larger as they approached, shadows gathering at its base like a graveyard fog. Lucas stopped at the base of the steps. He forced a grin, but it felt like stretching a mask over his nerves. Let's go. The group hesitated for a fraction of a second, exchanging silent glances. They all felt it, the sensation that they were crossing some unseen threshold. James slung his camera over his shoulder, gave a brief nod, and followed Lucas. One by one, they climbed the steps and crossed into the waiting jaws of Black Hollow Manor. The front doors groaned as Lucas pushed them open, their hinges screaming in protest. The air inside hit them like a wall, cold, damp, and heavy with the stench of mildew and rotting wood. Their flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, casting narrow cones of light that danced across the warped floorboards and crumbling wallpaper. Dust drifted through the air in lazy spirals, glinting like ash. Marie stepped forward and scanned the room. Her flashlight beam landed on a massive chandelier hanging precariously above the entryway. Its glass crystals were dull and coated with grime, swaying slightly as if stirred by some unseen breath. The house wasn't just old, it was a monument to silence, a tomb where memories curled in the corners like dust. Marie's gaze shifted to the mantel, where a portrait hung at a crooked angle. The face in the painting was gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes that seemed to follow them. Elias Fletcher. His expression wasn't just cold, it was oppressive. Elias Fletcher built this house in 1851, Marie murmured. He was a philanthropist, or so they said. And, Ethan prompted, stuffing his hands into his pockets to hide the fact that they were shaking. Marie's fingers traced the edge of her research binder. And in 1879, he vanished along with his entire family. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. They just disappeared. James adjusted his camera harness and squinted at the portrait. Or maybe they got sick of this decor and left, he muttered, cracking a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. Marie shot him a glare. Or maybe it was something else. Lucas's voice cut through the tension. Stick to the plan. James, you're with me in the basement. Marie, stay with Nina on the ground floor. Ethan, check the west wing for EMF spikes. Nina's eyes widened. Wait, we're splitting up? Her voice was tight with unease. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but he knew they couldn't waste time. We need to cover more ground. Marie placed a hand on Nina's shoulder and squeezed gently. We'll be fine, she said softly, though her voice wavered. Nina exhaled shakily and nodded, though every part of her screamed that this was wrong. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, warped and stained with age. Lucas reached out, wrapped his hand around the tarnished brass handle, and paused. The metal was ice cold beneath his fingers, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the door was pulsing. The door let out a slow, mournful creak as it swung open. A staircase stretched into the gloom below, steep and narrow. The air that wafted up from the darkness wasn't just musty, it was foul, tinged with the metallic stench of rust and something else, something sour. James adjusted the strap of his camera harness, the lens catching a glint of light. "Why is it always basements?" he muttered under his breath. "Cliché, man." Lucas gave a nervous chuckle. "For the ambiance." Their footsteps echoed unnaturally as they descended. Lucas counted each step to steady himself. The farther down they went, the thicker the air became, pressing against their lungs like damp cotton. The basement opened into a wide chamber with a low ceiling. Old crates and broken furniture were piled against the walls, draped with sheets that had rotted to thin veils. A workbench sat at the center, cluttered with rusted tools that hadn't seen a human hand in decades. James knelt and set the EVP recorder on the workbench. The small red light blinked as it began to record, filling the room with the familiar hum of static. For several seconds, there was nothing but the crackling hiss of white noise. Lucas exhaled, the sound loud in the silence. And then, "You shouldn't be here." The voice slithered through the speakers, low, guttural, and wet, like something speaking from the bottom of a well. James's hands froze mid-adjustment. "Tell me you heard that." His voice was barely above a whisper. Lucas's flashlight beam swept through the darkness like a scalpel, slicing shadows until it landed on the far wall. The basement door above slammed shut. Bang! James flinched, nearly dropping his camera. Dust rained down from the beams overhead. Lucas's pulse thundered in his ears. What the hell? Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, something shifted. A shape detached itself from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like embers in a dying fire. James whispered, his breath shallow. "Oh, God." The figure didn't move. It simply watched. Lucas's throat went dry as he whispered, "Run." The air in the dining hall felt colder than before, as though the house had taken notice of them. Nina hugged her arms tightly as she and Marie stepped cautiously around the shattered glass and dust-covered furniture. Their flashlights swept across overturned chairs and faded portraits of somber faces. The faces seemed to shift in the dim light, as if the paint itself was restless. Marie stopped in front of a massive mirror mounted on the far wall. Its ornate frame was carved into the shapes of twisting vines and skeletal hands that seemed to reach inward toward the glass. Nina's breath fogged the surface as she stared at her own reflection. Something about it felt wrong. Her reflection didn't match her movements. It was a second too slow. She tilted her head slightly, and the mirrored Nina hesitated, then followed with an almost imperceptible grin. Nina gasped, stumbling back. "Marie, the mirror." Marie turned just in time to see the fractures spread across the glass like veins. The mirrored version of Nina's face twisted, her eyes turning black as voids. A low hum began to build in the room, vibrating through their bones. The chandelier above them trembled on its rusted chain, sending a chorus of crystalline chimes echoing through the hall. "Nina!" Marie grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "It's not real. Look at me." Nina's scream pierced the stillness. a sound that wasn't entirely her own. Her knees buckled as she dropped to the floor, clutching her head. The hum shifted into a series of whispers, dozens of voices, layered and indecipherable, as though an entire room of people were speaking at once. Marie's heart pounded as she fumbled with the journal in her bag. The Latin incantations they had prepared seemed to blur in her mind. The pages felt too thin, like they would tear apart in her trembling hands. The mirror's surface rippled like water. Slowly, a shape began to form, a figure with gaunt features and hollow eyes, just like in the basement. It pressed its hand against the glass, and the fingers left behind long, dark smears. "Nina, get up!" Marie pulled her, trying to drag her toward the hallway, but Nina's body felt like dead weight. The whispers rose into a chaotic crescendo. The shadows in the corners of the room slithered toward them, dark tendrils reaching across the floor. Lucas and James had reached the bottom of the staircase when the EVP recorder let out another burst of static. "Help! Us!" It wasn't the guttural voice from before, it was Marie's. Her voice was faint, as though it was coming from far away. James's eyes widened. "Was that—" Lucas didn't hesitate. He spun on his heel and bolted back up the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly against the walls. The basement door, which had slammed shut earlier, opened with a deafening creak as he shouldered into it. James was right behind him, clutching the camera as though it was the only solid thing left in the world. The sound of shattering glass echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Lucas's heart surged with dread as he sprinted down the hallway. "Nina! Marie!" The dining hall was bathed in a strange, flickering glow as Lucas and James burst through the doorway. For a moment, all Lucas could do was stare. The room was transformed into a nightmare. The broken mirror was pulsing with black tendrils that snaked across the walls. The shadows twisted like living things. Marie was kneeling next to Nina, desperately whispering Latin verses through trembling lips. Nina's face was pale, her eyes glazed with terror. "Marie!" Lucas's voice broke through the chaos. He and James rushed to their side, but as soon as they crossed the room's threshold, the shadows recoiled, slamming the door shut behind them. James slammed his shoulder against the door, but it didn't budge. His wide eyes flicked to the mirror. "It's in there," he gasped. The figure in the mirror twisted and pressed its face against the glass. Its hollow eyes locked onto Lucas. Slowly, it raised its hand and pointed directly at Nina. The tendrils lashed out like whips. Lucas dove, shielding Nina as a crackling tendril of shadow struck the floor where she had been. "Marie, keep going!" Lucas shouted, his voice ragged. James reached into his pack and yanked out one of the UV flares, lighting it with a sharp hiss. The room was flooded with harsh violet light. The shadows shrieked and writhed, their forms unraveling into smoke. Marie's voice grew louder, steadier as she recited the incantation. The journal's pages fluttered in the sudden wind as she read the final verse. The glass of the mirror began to split, fractures spreading outward in jagged lines. The figure in the glass clawed at the surface, its form disintegrating as the cracks deepened. With a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded into a shower of glittering shards. The force of it knocked everyone back. Lucas scrambled to Nina, pulling her into his arms as the last echoes of the mirror's destruction faded into silence. Nina blinked slowly, her eyes clearing. "Is it over?" she whispered. Lucas's chest tightened. Almost. The room seemed to inhale, the shadows collapsing inward as though drawn to a central point. The chandelier above trembled, its crystals clinking like funeral bells. The shadow that had haunted them reformed, rising from the shards. It towered above them, a writhing mass of limbs and hollow eyes, screaming with fury. Marie didn't flinch. She lifted the journal again, her voice ringing through the room. Lucas clutched Nina tightly, his eyes blazing with defiance. James lit another flare, holding it high. The violet light clashed with the darkness, forcing the shadow back step by step. The front door burst open and sunlight poured in, golden, bright, pure. The shadow let out a final, agonized scream, a sound like glass shattering against stone. The light consumed it, burning away every last tendril of darkness until there was nothing left but silence. Nina collapsed into Lucas's arms, her breath ragged. "Is it over?" she whispered again. Lucas nodded, though something in him wasn't sure. The morning sun bathed the wreckage of Black Hollow Manor in soft gold. The walls that had once seemed endless now looked small, shrunken in the daylight, exposed and fragile. James dropped the last of his gear into the van and wiped a trembling hand across his face. He'd captured everything, the screams, the shadows, the flashes of violet light, but the footage felt like a burden, not a trophy. Marie sat on the stone steps, her head resting in her hands. She didn't cry. She simply breathed, counting each inhale and exhale as though convincing herself she was alive. Nina leaned against Lucas, her voice soft. "I saw it. The other side. I felt it pulling me." Lucas's throat tightened. "But you didn't let go." James powered on his camera. The footage was static, but there was one frame. The figure stood at the window. Its hollow eyes gleamed faintly, and it was smiling. Some echoes never fade. Some places never let go. If you've made it this far, thank you for stepping into the darkness with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. What would you do if something called your name from the shadows? Stay curious, stay cautious, and always beware of what watches from the dark.